Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It is with great pleasure that I have an opportunity today to sum up on these bills before the House, the Omnibus Repeal Bill, Repeal Day Bill 2014, the Amending Acts 1901 to 1969, Repeal Bill 2014, the Statute Law Revision Bill number 1 2014. Now, this is very hard for the Labor Party to stomach. We've come up with an idea that you did not think of first. We've come up with an idea to deregulate the Australian economy, not re-regulate the Australian economy. And this omnibus bill, and we've heard from the members on our side, not from the members opposite, but from the members on our side, how aged care building certification will no longer be duplicated at the federal and state level, how Telstra won't have to provide 70,000 pages of wholesale contracts to the ACCC, because now they can just provide a list of the contracts they enter into with the ACCC, with the opportunity to ask for those individual contracts as they wish. All these measures within this omnibus bill, together with the legislation that we introduced last week in the House, together with the whole range of other measures that we've either previously introduced or done so in a way through administrative manner, has produced a $720 million payoff for the Australian economy, for small businesses, for families, and for the not-for-profit organisations. Now, this has got rid of more than 10,000 unnecessary and redundant regulations and acts. Why didn't you think of that? Why didn't you think of that? And the reason is, Madam Speaker, the Labor Party didn't think of this was because their default position is to regulate. Their default position in their DNA is to increase regulation. 21,000 additional regulations were introduced under the previous Rudd and Gillard governments. That's a shameful legacy. And what did it mean? It meant that our country, multi-factor productivity in this country, fell by around 3% from the 5 years from mid-2007. That the World Economic Forum did a survey of 148 countries and found that Australia was 128th, a pitiful 128th in terms of the overall regulatory burden. And that the Economist's Intelligence Unit did a survey of 51 countries for productivity growth. And where did Australia come? 50 out of 51. Only marginally ahead of Botswana. Only marginally ahead of Botswana.
The member for Kingston is not in a correct
Madam
place and
Speaker,
is not entitled to interject.
Is the legacy that this government, that the previous Labor government left us. This is despite Kevin Rudd promising a one-in, one-out policy when it came to regulations. This is despite Craig Emerson, who was then the Minister for Small Business in 2008, one of 6 small business ministers that Labor had, saying he would take a giant pair of scissors. How big? A giant pair of scissors to cutting red tape. And instead they gave us 21,000 regulations. Do you know that there was an independent Borthwick-Milliner review that the Labor Party, the member for Watson should listen to this, your own previous government commissioned the Borthwick-Milliner independent review into the operation of regulatory processes and found that your government was disregarding the need for a RIS process, for a regulatory impact statement. There are more than 80 examples of non-compliance by the previous Labor government when it comes to the regulatory impact statement. More than 80. And it includes some of the biggest and most important legislative changes that they brought into place. The carbon tax, the mining tax, the changes to Fair Work, FOFA, the NBN. All of those were shamefully exempt by the then Labor government from the regulatory impact statement process. You weren't interested in understanding what is the impact on business, on the not-for-profit sector, on compliance, on productivity, on new entrants, on jobs, on jobs, on jobs. And that's why, under your government, we saw an increase in unemployment and a slowdown in productivity. Because you did not pay attention, the previous Labor government, Madam Speaker, did not pay attention to the true impact of the regulations that they were introducing. Now, as I have met with industry groups, with not-for-profit organisations, with small businesses around the country as part of this government's deregulation effort, I've identified 5 key areas which we need to tackle in our deregulation fight. First, volume. There is too much volume of regulation, and that the Labor government previously gave us 21,000 additional ones. Madam Speaker, secondly, there is massive duplication in our federal system between federal and state governments. And we are trying to tackle this because we do not want to see companies go through the process which the BCA documented for one environmental approval, which cost the company more than $20 million, took more than 2 years, required 4,000 meetings, 12,000-page report, and then when the approval came through, it had 1,500 conditions attached, 1,200 at the state level and 300 at the federal level. We have said no more. Do we want that level of duplication between federal and state? And Greg Hunt, the Minister for the Environment, should be congratulated because he has succeeded in getting the signatories from all states and territories, even from the Labor states and territories, onto the MOUs for one-stop shop environmental approvals. The third area that we must tackle as part of our deregulation effort, in addition to the volume, in addition to the duplication, is we need better forms of consultation with those who are most affected by regulations. You see, under the Labor government, that the Australian people were subject to over the last 6 years, under the previous Labor government, there was no genuine consultation. The Labor government presented their 21,000 regulations, new additional regulations, to those stakeholders as a fait accompli. There was no genuine consultation. A little bit of negotiation around the edges, maybe, but no genuine consultation. So we have said, as a government, we will have the RIS process, we will have a RIS process, and we will genuinely consult with those parties that are most affected by any new regulation. Fourthly, we are going to ensure that we have mandatory post-implementation reviews and greater use of sunset clauses. Because under the previous Labor government, there was no mandatory reviews. The minister sitting alongside me knows in his own area of social services that there have been thousands of regulations introduced by previous Labor governments that have lived on the statute books long after their use-by date. So we want to ensure that statutes do not live on and regulations do not live on beyond their use-by date. We need better use of sunset clauses. We need to ensure there are mandatory post-implementation reviews. And if we do need to review or renew a regulation, then let's do it. But let's not leave redundant regulations on the statute books. And fifth and finally, Madam Speaker, a key area for our deregulation effort is dealing with the role of the regulators. Because, yes, the regulations on the statute books are important, but equally important is how those regulations are administered. And the member for Watson may laugh, Madam Speaker. He thinks this issue is funny. But this issue is not funny. This is a very serious issue.
The member will resume his seat.
This is a very serious issue because the role of the regulators need to be looked at, and what we have commissioned and released last week is a Productivity Commission report which provides us with a framework for auditing the performance of the regulators. We say to the ACCC, to APRA, to the ATO and to ASIC, you do a very important job, but you must get the balance right between risk and cost. You must get the balance right between the risk and cost, because if you blindly administer regulations without understanding the impact it has on stakeholders, then you will drive up the cost of business to the point that it's counterproductive for the economy. And the Commonwealth has 75 external regulators and 68 internal regulators. So this Productivity Commission review provides some very important information about how do we audit the performance of the regulators. Do they, for example, distinguish as organisations between their licensing and advice functions and their enforcement functions, which is consistent with good governance? Do they encourage self-regulation where it's appropriate? Do they have good, regular dialogue with the key stakeholders that are affected? We are going to tackle the role of regulators. Now, Madam Speaker, as I said, we have introduced measures which will produce a dividend, a compliance saving to the Australian people of more than $700 million. And we have done that by avoiding duplication between federal and state levels, but also between state levels, and one of our great initiatives is around NOPSEMA, Offshore Petroleum Approvals Process, because we do not want two federal regulators duplicating there. We have streamlined existing measures like in the Omnibus Bill, which deals with overlapping building certification requirements for the aged care sector. So we now will not have that duplication. We have said on the Personal Property Security Act, how can you define a motor vehicle as being equivalent to a whacker-packer or to a scissor lift, which is currently the definition under the PPSA, which means that the compliance burden on small hire firms is very prohibitive. We have said to not-for-profit organisations like the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, when you are managing a $100 million Commonwealth program like HIPPY, which provides education support for disadvantaged families around the country, you shouldn't have to report to the Federal Education Department on a monthly basis in detail. You can do it on a quarterly basis, and that can save you up to $500,000. We have taken a number of measures which have dealt with the duplication and which have dealt with streamlining. And we've also taken an axe to those regulations which are producing very silly outcomes. And the member for Watson may be a great fan of Kung Fu Panda, but I bet you he didn't know before our repeal day that the Kung Fu Panda required 4 sets of classifications because it was in DVD, in 2D, in 3D and in Blu-ray, and we've said we just need 1 set of classifications to save thousands of dollars. We have said job service providers no longer need to keep paper records of job applications where one job service provider had 336 cabinets full of paper records. 336 cabinets full of paper records when you can keep those electronically online. And we have said about the university sector, where they face a $280 million annual compliance burden in the university sector, we have said through the Minister for Education, we will do something significant to cut that regulatory burden. And it was Universities Australia who said this government is now walking the talk on deregulation. And one of the things we've done is we've said universities no longer have to report in detail to the federal departments about how they use their lecture theatres and their tutorial halls and their academic offices. Madam Speaker, these are just some of the many, many measures that we have introduced. But more important than the legislative measures and the administrative measures that we have introduced, we are adopting processes like the regulatory impact statements, which will be adhered to by our government in a way that will ensure we will better understand the true impact on the taxpayer, on small business, on families, on the not-for-profit organisations of over-regulation. It's something that the previous government had their head in the sand about. And they gave us 21,000 additional regulations. So I am very confident that as we move towards our $1 billion target, our $1 billion annual red tape reduction target, and with the deregulation units that are set up in every minister's office, and with the fact that the Prime Minister, in every minister's department, the fact that the Prime Minister is now taking responsibility, that not only we will save money for those people who create jobs or help those most in need, but we'll be upholding freedom, We'll be encouraging personal responsibility, and we'll be ensuring that the nanny state lives no longer in Australia.
The